grieving. Okay, today what I would like to do is begin addressing a very short but very rewarding and deservedly famous dialogue of Plato called the Meno. It poses some very basic dilemmas concerning knowledge. And I want us to tackle them and see how the problems that are raised are dealt with. Now, as in most of Plato's writings, we are presented with a dialogue. And the dialogue is an account of a discussion. And the principal figure in the discussion is Socrates. Now, Socrates, as you would know most explicitly if you've read the Apology, purports to be someone who has knowledge of one thing and one alone. He's aware of his own ignorance. He knows that he is ignorant. He has all sorts of beliefs. He has all sorts of experiences, but he is uncertain of the truth of any. But unlike most of those he encounters, he does not think he knows things of which he ends up being uncertain. He is aware of his own ignorance. And in this respect, he presents us with a paradigmatic standpoint of someone who is ready to engage in philosophical investigation. Because to engage in the search for truth involves recognizing that one is ignorant, that one may have all sorts of beliefs, but one is uncertain of their validity, and only from that standpoint, where one is in a position to call into question all given opinions, is one ready to engage in philosophical investigation and engage in a search for truth. Now, Socrates conducts himself in a way that also is characteristic of what might appear to be one's only resources at the outset of the search for knowledge. If one is aware of one's own ignorance, one is not in a position to advance any claims about anything with any authority. One cannot suddenly spit out knowledge and make assertions in a positive manner about any topic whatsoever. It would seem that all one can do is, instead of providing answers, raise questions. But then the question is, what questions? If one is aware only of one's own ignorance, how will one possibly know what questions are the proper questions to ask? And it is significant about how Socrates conducts himself that he engages in what has come to be known as the Socratic method, a method that is often attributed to mean first-year law professors who will grill law students on the cases they are supposed to have read. But they're not practicing the Socratic method. Because in the case of Socrates, he is not the source of which questions to be raised. What elicits his questioning are claims of others who purport to have some knowledge. And it's in response to their knowledge claims that he engages in questions. Now the question to ask is, what can that questioning possibly provide in the way of knowledge? How can someone who does not yet know anything for certain how can such a figure critically question and evaluate the claims put forward by others who purport to have knowledge? Now, ordinarily, if you're going to evaluate the truth or falsity of a claim, you would need to know something in order to be able to sit in judgment on that claim and determine whether it's true or false. What would you seem to have to know? What would you seem to have to know? Well, generally speaking, you'd have to know the truth concerning what that knowledge claim is about. If someone is making a claim about what virtue is, it would seem the only way to question them in a way that could evaluate the truth or falsity of their view is if one knew what virtue is and then could compare the knowledge one has of what virtue is with what they claim virtue to be. But Socrates is not in a position to be able to do that. So what can his questioning provide? Well, his questioning can be looked upon as an engagement in what I will call a negative dialectic, in contrast to a positive dialectic. And later we'll use the term dialectic, as we'll see later on in certain discussions in the Republic. This questioning can be considered to be an engagement in negative dialectic because it has a negative outcome and cannot have anything more than the negative outcome. Because what Socrates will engage in doing is asking those who think they know something to, in a sense, prove that they know something, prove that the claim they're putting forward is not just an opinion, but is bona fide knowledge. And in doing so, he's obviously asking them to not just restate what they purport to know. He's asking them to supply some kind of reasons to back up or justify or legitimate or validate their claim. Now, of course, you could ask, how can someone who knows nothing possibly evaluate whether the reasons that are offered in defense of a supposed knowledge claim, how can someone who knows nothing evaluate whether those reasons are true or not? Once again, Socrates is in no position to say, well, the reason you provide is false because this is what is true. Instead, Socrates can only do two things. He can either show through his questioning that the propounder of a supposed knowledge claim has no reason to offer to back it up. If that can be shown, does that establish the falsity of the knowledge claim? Does it? What? Why not? What? Well, in other words, that doesn't prove that the claim is false because it simply shows the person who is uttering it is not able to support it, but maybe support can be found elsewhere. Right? So by showing that someone can support a knowledge claim, they have no reasons behind it, may indeed show that they are in no position to have any certainty that what they're offering is more than a mere opinion. But it does not disprove the truth of that opinion. It might be a right opinion, even if they cannot justify it or legitimate it. So in a sense, what Socrates could show, if the questioned individual is unable to offer any reasons in support of their claim, he at least can show them that the claim they have is not something they can be certain of being knowledge. The person in question who utters it can at best say, well, this is my opinion. But whether it's true or not, I am in no position to certify. Now, in addition to this, Socrates' question could bring out something else. Right? The other party could provide various reasons, but under questioning, Socrates could have that party come to recognize that the reasons that are offered may not do the job. They may not work. They may not end up supporting what they're supposed to justify. And they may not end up supporting it because they might have something about them that undercuts or contradicts or is inconsistent with the knowledge claim that they are put forward as something that would provide a reason to justify them. So in this way, Socrates can expose through his questioning the inconsistency or inadequacy in the reasons that are provided by the offerer of some purported knowledge. And in that way, too, there's a negative result. Once more, this doesn't prove that the claim is false. The fact that someone has inconsistent reasons to justify it does not mean that there are not other consistent reasons that could back it up, that that individual is unable to provide. But what Socrates can show to this individual is that although they thought they knew something, they really don't know what they thought they knew. They instead have to confront the fact that they have an opinion whose truth they are not in a position to establish. Now, Plato significantly presents Socrates in action in writings that take the form of a dialogue. The dialogue, as I mentioned, is an account of a discussion. You have the different speakers giving their discussion. There is no commentator upon the action. Plato does not step back and make any judgments on what is said. You just have the discussion itself. And although in a few of the later dialogues there'll be a young guy called Plato who will play a very minor peripheral role in the discussions, Plato himself does not appear. Plato does not tell us whether any of the speakers is presenting genuine knowledge. Plato does not identify which of the speakers is in the right, if any. And again, you might ask yourself, well, why would that be? Does this dialogue form that Plato is embracing have something to tell us about the nature of knowledge? If one didn't have this dialogue form, we could presume we have an author, and the author presents us with an account of what they know to be true. They make assertions. They make an argument. Plato, at least in these works, the works that have survived, does not want to engage in that kind of writing. There are, by the way, other philosophers who have adopted dialogue form. None of them do a job that is in any way a match for Plato. They are all rather cumbersome and unwieldy and unconvincing. Plato is very successful in using this form. But again, you want to ask yourself, why does he avoid simply speaking in his own right? Of course, what accusation could be made against him or any other philosopher if they were all of a sudden to just be offering you assertions, claims, argument? Well, one might ask, well, what is the authority of what you're asserting? Who's to say that these assertions do not come from a particular perspective that is biased, that is relative, that is conditioned in all sorts of ways? In adopting the dialogue form, Plato does not face that limitation, because we have something very objective before us. We have an action on thought. It's there. It unfolds. And we see where it goes. We see what happens. And that's not something that is biased or grounded in any particular vantage point. It's an objective happening. Now, the Meno is a fundamental text in regard to a consideration of knowledge, but it does not begin by taking up knowledge itself. It instead begins by considering the question of how virtue can be obtained. How virtue can be obtained. And there are three options that are pointed to as being the likely suspects, among whom we would want to choose and try to figure out which is the bona fide answer to the question of how virtue can be obtained. What are these options?
Whether it can be taught.
Whether it can be what?
Taught.
Taught, yeah. Is it something that can be taught?
Whether it can be learned from experience.
Yeah, whether it can be learned from experience or through practice, or something you have by nature. Right? Either it's something that can be taught, it can be something that you obtain through practice, the practice of doing virtuous conduct, or alternately, is it something that one has by nature? Now, in a sense, the question would seem to be obviously a very practical question. Because if we are concerned with realizing virtue, we ought to know how it ought to be obtained. On the other hand, it could also be said to have some bearing upon the very character of virtue. If you want to know what virtue is, how it can be obtained might shed light upon it. But also, conversely, there is a problem that Socrates raises. Right? The discussion is introduced by Meno as one where he is asking for some kind of clarification on how virtue can be taught. And Socrates points out, well, how can one know anything about virtue, about any of its qualities, such as how it is to be obtained, if one does not know what it is? Don't we have to know what virtue is in order to know anything else about it? Now, this question, in a sense, foreshadows the essential problem of the Meno. This essential problem of the Meno is really concerned about how we can obtain new knowledge. How can we obtain new knowledge at all without already knowing what we're looking for? How can we know anything about virtue, such as how it can be obtained, if we do not already know what virtue is? How can the search for knowledge that characterizes philosophy be possible? How can one obtain knowledge if one doesn't already know what it is that one is going to be making claims about? Right? It would seem that if one doesn't already know what the truth is, we're not in a position to be able to evaluate opinions other than in the very negative fashion that Socrates does. We can see whether there are reasons given to justify them, but at best all we can show is whether those reasons are consistent or inconsistent, but that will not tell us whether any claim is true or not. Well, before confronting this very basic problem, which obviously is going to come up, and come up in a very mind-numbing electric way later on, Meno makes successive attempts to determine what virtue is. Now that Socrates has raised the point that we're not going to be in any position to have anything to say about how virtue can be acquired if we don't know what virtue itself is. So, Meno is asked to tell us what virtue is, to make claims about it. And he begins by giving us a kind of laundry list. He tells us what the virtue of a male citizen is, what the virtue of a woman is, what the virtue of a child is, what the virtue of a slave is, etc., etc., etc. Now, Socrates asks, well, look, you're telling us what the virtue of a man who is a citizen is, a virtue of what a woman is, a virtue of a slave, a virtue of a child, and so forth. But what you're not telling us is what they all must share in common in order to be virtues. After all, if we want to know what virtue is, that is what we need to know. We need to know, in a sense, what it is that anything must have in order to qualify as virtue. And by telling us what a particular virtue is, you're telling us something that will not be what is shared in common. Because the virtue of a citizen is different from the virtue of a woman who is deprived of political rights. Right? But to know what virtue itself is, to know how all of these can be examples of virtue, requires us to get at something they share in common. Now, in a sense, this directs us to look for something of a certain kind, certain character, as an answer to the question, what virtue is, what anything is. The what question, the what is virtue, what is the good, what is knowledge, what is truth. It's clear that the answer to that question cannot lie in presenting us with particular examples. The particular example tells us what distinguishes that particular example from other different particulars. It doesn't lay hold of what we need to know, which is what they have in common, which allows them to be what they are. Now, for example, if you wanted to answer the question, what is it to be human? And you take out your ID. The ID, of course, presents us with an image. Well, you are human, yet why will this image of you not suffice as an answer to what it is to be human? Why can it not?
It's an extensional definition.
What?
It's an extensional definition.
What do you mean by that?
Socrates wants an analytic, intentional definition.
What do you mean by these terms?
Like ice is frozen water. Ice is the genus, water is the species, and the differentiates frozen. He wants something that gets to the essential nature of water.
No, but I'm asking in particular, before we ask what he's asking for, why it would be that an image of you or of any of us will not suffice as an answer to what it is to be human. Yes?
It's particular to you yourself and not humans.
I mean, after all, if what it is to be human is an image of you, I do not qualify as human, nor does anyone else in this room. And note, images are of such a character, they present something that has that kind of particularity. But in order to answer the question, what is virtue? Or we might ask, what is knowledge? Which is ultimately our subject matter. We need to find something that cannot be captured by simply pointing to examples of it. And that tells us right away. The answer to these questions cannot be provided for by anything that is simply an image, anything that is pictorial, anything that is figurative. Because what is figurative or pictorial or in any respect imagery is always something particular. It lacks what feature that we need in order to provide knowledge of what virtue is, or for that matter, what knowing is, or of the nature of anything. What type of knowledge do we need? What character must it have? If imagery is particular, knowledge in this case must have what character? It must be universal. It must be universal. And pictures cannot convey what is universal. What can convey what is universal? Thought. And what does thought need for its expression? What? Language, right? I mean, a picture may be worth more than 1,000 words because pictures have all sorts of individuated detail that in some respect could be considered inexhaustible by verbal description. But verbal expression can capture something that no picture can convey, that which is universal. And if we're trying to get at what virtue is, or for that matter, what knowing is, we're looking at what it is that any knowledge claim would have to have, or in the case of virtuous conduct, what any virtuous action would have to have in order to qualify as being virtuous, or in the case of knowledge, of being the real McCoy knowledge. which in some respect gives you a clue as to how one might understand why it would be that philosophical investigation, which relies strictly on thinking, may be in a position to deliver us knowledge in a way in which no other investigation can, which does not rely wholly on knowledge, on thinking, but relies on observation of what is figurative, pictorial, and so forth. Well, in a certain respect, the question that is asked, what is virtue, calls for a certain kind of answer. It calls for an answer in speech. It calls for an answer that is going to rely upon thinking. And you might think that the nature of the question, which is a question you will encounter in every dialogue of Plato, namely, what is, whatever may be the topic, what is friendship? What is nature? What is beauty? In each case, it might appear that the answer is to be had in terms of a certain kind of verbal expression. What might appear to be the verbal expression that's being looked for? What? After when you ask what is something, what commonly is provided as a response? What? Not an opinion, a specific kind of expression. A definition, right? A definition. A definition. Well, the definition will have, in a sense, as its subject, that which is to be defined, that whose character is to be provided for, that whose universal nature is to be identified by the definition. The definition is going to have some kind of description, some kind of attribution that is connected to the subject of the definition. Virtue is blah, blah, blah. And of course, Meno gives a variety of characterizations. Well, the point is, definition might appear to be the kind of answer we want. After all, it provides something that can only be given in words. It can only be given in an expression that identifies the universal identity of what is being looked for. But the definition offers the answer to what something is by means of a very familiar word. What is the word that, in a sense, connects the characterization of what is to be defined with the subject of the definition? What is the word? Is, right? Is. Virtue is, well, as Meno would say, that which could be regarded as providing what is beneficial, etc., different types of things. But note, let's say we're supplied with a definition, which after all, that is what Meno gives, a series of definitions to Socrates' question. How do we know whether the definition in question is true? Right? Because we have the subject, and then we have something else connected to it by is. Does the word is provide any justification for the connection it makes? Does it? Does it provide any reasons connecting the subject of the definition with the characterization the definition provides? Does it? It just says is. It's this immediate connection. This groundless a connection, this bare assertion, where what is said about virtue is what virtue is to be, without further explanation. Now, it's no accident that philosophy does not consist of a dictionary, a list of definitions. Right? You might feel that the definition is what we're looking for to provide knowledge. But somehow or other, the definition lacks something. At least something that would, in a sense, provide us with any new knowledge. It provides us with no justification for the assertion it's making. Because what it claims about what is being defined is offered immediately. That is, without any connecting mediation, to establish that what is being said about the term in question is what truly identifies it. Well, this tells us that, well, if we're really concerned with knowledge, something more would have to be at stake. Or if we're going to rely on definitions, the only way we can know that the definition is valid is if what was already in our possession. We already knew what the term is. So I could say, yes, virtue is what is being said about it. Now Socrates, of course, does not know what virtue is. He tells us he does not know what virtue is. So here he is confronted by Meno with a series of definitions regarding what virtue is. How then can Socrates deal with these different definitions? And I say different because under the questioning of Socrates, Meno has to abandon the definitions he gives. And the question is, why does he have to abandon them? Why does he have to abandon them? What is going on in these definitions that call upon Meno to have to revise what he states? For example, Meno will offer as a definition that virtue is something by which one obtains what is good. But then Socrates raises the question, well, don't you have to admit that it matters how one goes about obtaining what is good? What is a benefit? Isn't virtue a matter of obtaining what is a benefit in a way that is just and proper? Meno will agree with this, but then Socrates will point out, in saying this, aren't you doing something that is not going to be satisfactory for telling us what virtue is? Because here you're using the term just as a qualification for what is involved in being virtuous. And what is it that Meno will admit about justice that makes his appeal to justice something that makes his account of virtue inadequate?
That it's a virtue.
Yeah, that it is a virtue. Now, why should it be a problem if, in attempting to account for what virtue is, one makes use of a virtue, in this case justice, to specify its character?
On both sides of the is, you have the subject, basically. In the definition, you have the subject is, and then you state basically the subject again.
I mean, there's kind of a circularity here, in a way, but also there's another problem that takes us back to what would be involved in trying to say that what it is to be human is what I am. Because one is using a particular case of virtue to identify virtue in general. But there are other virtues, and they would not fit if one is speaking about a particular virtue as a way of identifying virtue in general. And it turns out that Meno is not able to escape that kind of problem. He's not able to come up with any way of accounting for virtue that does not involve using a particular virtue to identify it. He speaks about virtue being a desire, virtue being the desire for fine things and having the power to acquire them. But then it has to involve doing so in a particular way, and we have come across this circularity. And in effect, what we have here is a stumbling upon a problem that is going to be raised in the most general way at this pivotal point in the discussion, which takes us to confront the problem of knowledge. And the problem that is confronted in attempting to define virtue is that every attempt to identify it seems to require that one make use of something about virtue, some particular form of virtue. It seems in some respect we at least must be acquainted with particular virtues and know that there are particular virtues in order to identify what virtue is. It seems in some respect if we don't already know something about virtue, we're not in a position to be able to say anything about it. And it seems otherwise that every attempt to identify what something is, to provide knowledge about it, would seem to be making the same kind of immediate assertion that is made in a definition. One is saying, well, this is what it is. And yet, how can one be sure that this is what it is unless one already knew what it is? Now, of course, if it is the case that a definition is only going to be successful if one knows already that the definition fits what is being defined, then there's no need to make the definition, because one already has to know the character of what is being defined in order to engage in defining it, or equally in order to evaluate a definition. So in that respect, it would appear that the definition is not something that one can undertake as a way of obtaining knowledge. It rather is something that can only serve its purpose for those who already know what is to be defined. Now this poses a general problem that has come to be known as the problem of the me-node. And this is presented at this famous juncture in the discussion at ADD. And by the way, let me just point out that when we're dealing with texts of Plato, there was one of the first editions of his works came out with a certain pagination, and that pagination is to be found in most modern editions of Plato in the column. So if you look in the column of whatever text you have under ADD and following, you will see the text where Meno raises the following question. He writes, or I should say he writes, he says, as Plato reports, how will you look for it, for what it is you want to know? How will you look for it, Socrates, when you do not know at all what it is? How will you aim to search for something you do not know at all? If you should meet with it, how will you know that this is the thing that you did not know? Well, here's a fundamental question that strikes at the very possibility of obtaining new knowledge, of learning anything, of succeeding in a search for wisdom. Because in all these cases we're concerned with obtaining knowledge that we don't already have. Yet if we don't already know what it is we're looking for, and that would be the situation we're in, if we're searching for knowledge, then there are two things that we lack. First of all, we have no way of knowing what procedure or method to employ. Because if we don't know what we're looking for, we don't know how to go about finding it. Right? We don't know what kind of form of investigation to engage in. Secondly, we have no way of knowing that we found it, even if we stumble upon it. Because if we don't already know what we're looking for, how can we possibly recognize that we found it? Well, note the implications of this, because it seems to make the entire search for knowledge completely absurd. it seems to make the whole possibility of learning completely absurd. Because there's no way one could ever move from ignorance to knowledge, because one doesn't already know what one's looking for, one doesn't know how to operate, where to look, nor will we ever be in a position to recognize the prey that we're looking for. It would seem, in other words, we can only know what we already know. Which is to say, we can't learn anything. We can't obtain new knowledge. We can't be taught anything we don't already know. And it seems that there's hardly any escape from this problem. And this seems to apply most radically to the whole undertaking of philosophy, which proceeds from this radical ignorance, this radical recognition that none of one's opinions are beyond question. But then how can we ever move beyond opinion to knowledge? Well, Socrates points out that he feels like he's been jolted by an electric eel, or torpedo fish, a stingray, whatever. Yet he doesn't feel that the problem is insurmountable. And one might ask, well, what is it that Socrates can offer? Because all he seems to have been able to offer as someone who does not know anything but his own ignorance is questioning. A questioning that in and of itself would seem to be incapable of ever providing any positive knowledge. At most, the questioning can only expose inconsistencies in the reasoning others provide, or a lack of any reasons to support opinion. But that's never going to provide us with any positive knowledge. So, what could possibly provide any way out of this? Well, Socrates provides us with a myth that, in a sense, goes by the name of a myth of recollection, and it's provided as, in a sense, redeeming, in a certain way, philosophizing, the search for knowledge, learning, maybe even teaching. If one rethinks all of these activities in a certain respect. Now, this myth is provided as a myth. It's a story that has been told to Socrates. He's not claiming he knows this to be true. It's rather a representation. Not an argument, a representation that pertains to the process of knowing and gives us, in a sense, an image of another option that might give us a way out of the impasse to this problem of the Meno, this problem of how one can possibly know what one does not already know, how one can move from any ignorance to knowledge. Well, this myth involves an appeal to a story of reincarnation. Reincarnation that is a repeated reincarnation of souls. And it is, in a sense, tied to the idea of, a representation of, the soul being immortal. And a soul that is immortal, that is continually reincarnated from one living being into another living being. And in a sense, the claim is, according to this myth, that because we here have a soul that is both eternal and continually reincarnated, this soul has seen everything. This soul has seen everything. There is nothing it has not encountered. So, insofar as his soul has, in a sense, encountered everything, each individual who has a soul that is immortal, that has been through all time, that has had a chance to experience everything, has within it the traces, the memory of all things. So in a sense, individuals are in a position to, as Socrates says, discover everything for him or herself by recollecting. Now, this idea of recollection presumes that something has happened to the soul in its incarnations for it to have to be in a position to recollect. What, in a sense, is tied up to this myth? Yep.
Forgetting.
Exactly, forgetting. That is, the individual in its particular embodiment is in some respect in a state of ignorance, where it is not conscious of what is to be found in the trove of the memory of its eternal soul that has been everywhere throughout all time. But it can obtain what appears to be new knowledge about all that can be known by somehow recollecting. Now, if you ask yourself, well, what does that mean to recollect? Where does one have to look to recollect? Inside yourself. Inside yourself. So the notion is, because the soul is immortal, because it has observed all things, it has within itself everything that one can come to know. And one can come to know all these things. Why? Because first of all, one has forgotten them in one's current existence. But one is in a position to have a resource within which all possible knowledge is obtainable. It's just a question of being able to turn to that repository, that reservoir of what is recollectible. Now, in a sense, this involves turning inward. And you might ask yourself, well, what will facilitate that turn inward? Well, you might ask yourself, does this have any connection to what Socrates might be engaged in? After all, when Socrates asks questions of others, they have to look within to come up with an answer. They have to use their thinking and find what their mind can come up with to give an answer. So if it were the case that we all have latent in us these memories of all that is, but we have forgotten what it is that was once encountered. If we are questioned about something, we can somehow make use of that occasion of questioning to look within and retrieve the knowledge. In this way, questioning can arrive at a result very different from the negative outcome to which Socrates seemed limited. That is, his questioning heretofore seemed to be able to provide others with only one knowledge, the knowledge that they do not know what they thought they knew, the knowledge that they're unable to legitimate or justify their opinions. But now, if it were to be the case that the soul is immortal, that it has experienced everything before, it might appear that this then provides a situation where through questioning and through turning inward, one will be in a position to retrieve what is already latent in our souls. And in that respect, learning will actually end up being recollection. Which means that, well, what we can learn is what we can recollect. Now, if you think about this account, there are various questions that come into play. On the one hand, it might seem to give support to the idea that one obtains knowledge not through external teaching, but through questioning, where the questioner is a midwife of truth, where the questioner has us turn inward, and in turning inward, we come to retrieve what is already in our souls, thanks to the immortality of the soul and its being a soul that has been around and seen everything. Now, there are two obvious sort of discrepancies about this account. First of all, if you think about what it is that seemed to be required to answer the question, what is virtue? What is knowing? What is whatever? The answer seemed to require providing something that has what character? Universal, right? Something that could be considered, in the terminology that Socrates offers us, the form of something, the idea of something, the essence of something. We need to know the essence of virtue. We need to know the essence of knowing. This is not something we observe in the particular cases that we observe. Because after all, in our actual embodied lives, what are we encountering? Are we perceiving the forms, the essences, the natures, or are we encountering particular examples of them? Right? We have to recognize that if we're talking about what is involved in knowing the nature of things, what we have to entertain in our mind is something that can only be verbally expressed, something that can only be thought, not something that can be pictured, not something that imagery can successfully provide. But if we think of memory in the ordinary sense, of remembering what we have experienced in previous lives, we're talking about images, right? After all, we have our experiences, our observations, our intuitions, and then our imagination. Could be said to store them and retrieve them, reimagine them. And what we reimagine is an image, it's the memory. But the memories are particular. The memories are not the thought of the essence of something, of what something must be in order to qualify as a virtue, or what something must be to qualify as knowledge. So that's one problem with the way the myth is concerned. The other problem is we're told that learning and the obtaining of what appears to be knowledge is a matter of recollecting, retrieving from this, in a sense, unconscious repository of our mind what it is that is the true knowledge. Well, how do we know which content in our mind is that true knowledge? How do we know which content in our mind is the bona fide recollection? I mean, after all, we can have any number of contents that we imagine. And moreover, how can we be sure that whatever may be in our mind to be recollected is true? Now, in a sense, the talk presumes not only that the soul has been able to obtain knowledge in its past life, but also that what it has obtained is true. Now, first of all, how does the soul obtain knowledge in the first place in its previous lives? Right? It can't do it through recollection, right? So how does it do it? How does it, in a sense, itself overcome the problem that was raised by Meno? How does the soul in its past life know what it is experiencing? Know what things are? If it doesn't already know what they are. If it doesn't know where to look for them. In some respect, this account puts off to earlier lives the same old problem of obtaining knowledge in the first place. Presuming that somehow that could be done, and now we are in a position, bestowed with eternal souls, to make use of what has been acquired. But how could it have been acquired to begin with? Without facing the same problems. If one doesn't already know what one is looking for, how does one know how to find it, how to acquire it, let alone how does one know that one has it? Now, in a certain sense, one might say, okay, maybe we don't have to think in these terms of the soul having to be immortal, having to have first obtained knowledge, because that just pushes to the past the same old problem without providing us with a remedy. Why couldn't we say instead, well, the mind has to have innate in it. It has to have, as part of its structure, an unconscious trove of, in a sense, what is bona fide knowledge. What is not merely images from particular experiences, but forms. What if we were to regard our minds as having innately in them, as part of their structure, ideas, the nature of things, which, however, we are not immediately conscious of, but we have to have a way of retrieving them. And because we have them, then we're going to be in a position to know what it is we've stumbled upon when we're trying to discover what virtue is and the like. Yes?
Wouldn't you still be subject to the same problem you first brought up about then how you know that's a proper recollection of what is truly?
Yeah, I mean that would be a question, right? How do we know that what is innate in your mind is itself the true nature of things? Of course, this would also presume, or we would also raise a possibility that who's to say that what is innate in my mind is innate in your mind or other minds? What if there are different repositories? In a sense, we can only come to know what we already have in us and could never know anything beyond that. We can never teach anyone else what resides in the innate structure of our mind if they don't share that innate structure. Right? So you can think of there being still a lot of difficulties that are to be had. Now Socrates is offering this, he tells us, as a story. He's not going to claim that he knows it to be true. He offers it as something that he says has a pragmatic value, that it would be better for us to entertain this story so that we don't give up the search for truth. Because it might appear if we don't accept this kind of story, that learning is recollection, then the search for knowledge seems utterly hopeless. Then there seems no way to really question opinion. Then there seems no way to examine any norms or values. And it might appear that there's no way that our life could be a life of value. We would be stuck with a life that really could not be examined. Yes?
I'm trying to develop this thought.
Yes.
Okay, I'm going to try to defend Plato a bit. Okay, so our perceiving bodily organs can access what is physically perceptible, images and things like that. The forms, we take it, are immaterial, they're intelligible, and the soul is immaterial. Maybe it has some sort of access to intelligible forms in that way.
And how does one have access to these forms? How does one have access? How do we have the access to them? Exactly, in thinking. in discourse.
So the soul thinks.
In discourse.
So they're
Right.
intelligible.
In discourse. And that's where we obtain them. So in a sense, ultimately, if we want to revise the myth to be more compatible with the intelligible character of the knowledge of the nature of things, what is recollected are the forms themselves, the ideas of the forms, which it would seem are not obtained directly through experience, but at best through reflection upon experience, whereby one attempts to think what it is that the examples we experience share in order to be what they are. Okay? But then there's still the question, well, I mean, it would seem that, as we've seen from the problem put forward by Meno, to be sure that a candidate for the true form of something is the true, would seem to require that we already know what its proper essence is. It seems, therefore, that we already have to have knowledge of that in order to know anything. So we could maybe consider that to be innate, something we're not conscious of, but can become conscious of, and that way we can sort of rethink in a way that is perhaps more amenable this idea that learning is recollection. Now, as you know, the Meno does not leave things here. The dialogue advances to a very famous discussion and experiment, one could say, where Socrates attempts to answer a question that Meno raises. Meno asks Socrates, well, can you teach me that learning is recollection? Now, in a certain sense, this might appear to be a kind of ludicrous question, because the theory about recollection has indicated that in a way one doesn't learn through teaching. It's not as if someone gives you something you don't have. Rather, the only way you can, so to speak, learn is if you're questioned and look inside yourself to retrieve the forms that grasp the true nature of things. But in a way you could say, look, what is Meno doing? He's asking Socrates to, in a sense, in some respect, justify this picture of knowing, of learning, that he has provided by appeal to this myth. And Socrates is going to attempt to do that. He's going to do that. Even though Socrates, to begin with, he recognized, look, the question is absurd, as he says on 82a. He says the question is absurd because the theory itself rules out teaching, as I just indicated. If there's going to be any kind of proof, it's going to have to consist in a recollection on the part of Meno. Meno has to recollect the true nature of knowing, of learning, right? Because, after all, what is presented by the myth is that learning is a matter of recollection. So you might think, well, what Socrates ought to be doing to, in effect, prove his case is question Meno further. But he doesn't do that. He doesn't do that. He instead says, look, there's a slave in the house. Let's subject him to an examination, to a question. And what we will be doing in examining the slave is to determine whether he is learning something through teaching or learning something through recollection. Now, what's in some respect perplexing about this whole exercise is that what is going to provide validation for the myth of recollection is something that Socrates and Meno are going to observe in the world happening before them. Right? Something outside them. is in some respect going to provide evidence for a theory. But the theory itself indicates that the only way you can learn something is by looking inward and recollecting a form within. Yet what is going to be done is to try to take up an example of someone who is going to be coming to know something they didn't already appear to know. And the question is, has the slave come to know something he did not already know by being instructed from outside? Or has he come to know something he didn't already know through recollection? Now, why is it that a slave boy is picked as the subject of this examination? Why is it?
He has no geometry.
Yeah, he hasn't studied. If he were free, if he were the son of a gentleman and a potential citizen, he would be educated. But the slave is uneducated. So presumably, he has not been taught as if one could be taught, right? The truths of geometry. Note, the reason for taking the slave itself seems to go against the theory, right? Because what the slave can know should not be based upon whether or not he's been taught something, but whether he's in a position to recollect it. But still, what's in question is whether learning is recollection or whether learning comes from outside through teaching. So at least here we have someone who has not been taught, right? He hasn't been taught. He knows a few things. He knows what a square is. He knows that the sides of a square are equal. And if you have a square that's 1 by 1, he knows that it is something that has an area of 1 foot square. And he can see, note, he can see, when Socrates draws for him a diagram of a square that's 2 feet by 2 feet, and which you can draw into 4 square components, right, that make it up each 1 foot by 1 foot. So you have 1 foot by 1 foot, 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 with a square that's 2 foot by 2 foot. The slave boy can see that its area is 4 square feet. Right? Well, it would appear that the area of this square that's 2 feet by 2 feet is twice the length of the side. So now Socrates asks the slave the question, what is going to be the length of the side of a square that has an area of 8 square feet? 8 square feet. And what is the answer the slave boy gives and why? What is the answer he gives?
Double
4.
Double the first line?
Yeah, he presumed, given what appeared to be what he sees in the square that's 2 feet by 2 feet, that its area is 4, which is twice the side, that if we have a square that's going to be 8 square feet, the side will be half of 8, will be 4. But that is not the case. So note, and Socrates goes to show him that that's not the case. Right? You draw a square that's 4 by 4. Right? You divide it up into 4 parts, each of which, right, is a 2 by 2 square, which he already knows has an area of 4. He can add. He knows that his total area is 16. So a square that has a side that's 4 feet long, does not have an area of 8. The question is, what is the length of the side of an 8-foot square? Now note, Socrates, through his questioning of the slave boy, has got the slave boy to recognize that he doesn't know what he thought he knew. But Socrates is going to get him to come to know the length of a square that has an area of 8. And as you know, he's going to do it. We have this large square that's 4 feet by 4 feet. You think of it as composed of 4 squares, each of which is 2 by 2. And now you draw the diagonal in each of those 2 squares that make the top half, and diagonals coming to a point on the bottom half. That makes another square inside the larger square, right? That has half the area. How do you know it has half the area? It's a diagonal which bisects each of those 4 component squares that make it up, right? The slave boy can see this. He can see, in other words, that we're dealing with something that is going to be a square having that area of 8 feet. So he now knows that it's going to be the diagonal of what? It will be the side of an 8-foot square. The diagonal of what?
2 by 2 square.
Yeah, the diagonal of the 2 by 2 square. He can see this. And he comes to discover this. Now Socrates has only been asking questions throughout. He's only been asking questions of the slave boy. And because he's only been asking questions of the slave boy, never giving him an answer and instructing him of what the truth is, but instead questioning him, Socrates suggests to Meno that what we have just experienced is a demonstration of how learning is recollection. Now, what is it about what has happened that Socrates thinks, and Meno seems to be agreeable, that this shows that learning is recollection? What is it that has happened? It would indicate that in obtaining knowledge that the slave boy did not appear to already have, namely, he now knows what is the length of the side of a square that has an area of 8 square feet. He's come to know that. But Socrates wants to say that the way he's come to know that shows that it was not through teaching but through recollection. He wasn't taught this earlier, he didn't study geometry. Well, what is it that Socrates feels establishes the case? Yes?
He was questioning first to determine whether he could allow himself.
Yeah, the idea is he was questioned, and presumably when you're questioned, you rely upon your own resources. And so it might appear he's just looked within, and in a sense he's demonstrated what is at stake. Now, it's important to realize 2 things. First of all, the knowledge in question here is it the same kind of knowledge that was at stake in asking what is virtue? Is it? I mean, first of all, what kind of knowledge are we talking about in this example?
Geometry.
It's geometry. And what kind of knowledge of geometry? What?
Logically rational.
Well, is it a matter, for example, of uncovering a general geometric theorem, such as the Pythagorean theorem? It's not that, right? What kind of knowledge was it? What? Well, it was a very particular knowledge. It was about knowledge about the length of a very specific square. It was not knowledge about a general geometric truth. That's one thing to keep in mind. It was not knowledge that was universal in the same way in which the knowledge concerning virtue is universal. It's a mathematical knowledge. But moreover, if you think back on what led the slave boy to obtain this particular knowledge, it depended upon something more than questioning. What was that added element that you're all familiar with when you did if you did do any kind of Euclidean geometry in high school? I assume most of you did, if not all of you.
Pictures.
Yeah, pictures, or what do we call the term when we're dealing with those? The kind of proofs, which of course are not about the length of a particular square, but lengths of squares in general, or of triangles, etc. We speak of it as construction, right? You make constructions, right? I mean, you remember making geometric proofs. You would make the proof based upon making drawings of various kinds. Now, the drawings you made were not drawings that were about a particular square of a particular dimensions. They were drawings that were to represent the square in general, isosceles triangle in general, didn't matter this particular length. But here there are constructions made, drawings made. And it's on the basis of the drawing and reflecting on the drawing and seeing the drawing that we can see. You can see, I can see, the slave boy can see that the length of a square of an area of 8 is the diagonal of the square. It's 2 by 2. So you want to reflect on that and ask whether, well, has this proven something to justify that learning could be recollection? Now we want to think about it. We've raised various problems about this supposed remedy. As we move on into the latter part of the Meno, the discussion is going to shift back to virtue. But it's also going to add certain aspects to the character of knowing and the character of what recollection involves that you want to be on the lookout for. And then we're going to return to some very famous sections of the Republic that are going to explore other dimensions of knowing that might help resolve the difficulties that afflict the, let's say, preliminary remedy that has been offered to us by Socrates. So go ahead and do that reading for next week.